Susan? Susan, are you there? Susan, if you can hear us, give us a sign. Rise, my minions, and serve me in this war. Necromancy provides a myriad of fascinating options, magically and in general world-building terms as a monster. Today, I would like to take a look at what happens if you take necromancy and you make it your government. What happens if your magocracy is based on necromancy. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you have not yet done so, please do hit the subscribe button down below. And if you'd like to join my community of world builders, there's a link to the Discord down below as well. First, let's talk about what is necromancy. Necromancy started out as communicating with the dead, hence my demonstration of the talking to Susan, the dearly departed, or in this day and age, I suppose it could have been Susan whose sound isn't working on the Zoom call, but probably Susan, the dearly departed. That kind of necromantic communication has come to us since the Greek days. It was used in the Odyssey, where Circe taught it to our heroes. The specific ritual that the Greeks talked about was called katabasis. Hope I pronounced that somewhere in the vague vicinity of correctly. They used it to communicate to the dead. Most often you would have to travel into the underworld to use this kind of ritual. It wasn't something you could do just anywhere. You would also typically have to give the spirit that is thus raised animal blood to drink. You're not just going to raise the dead and, there it is, there's your spirit, ask your questions, all said and done. You're going to have to actually engage in a pretty severe ritual. That ritual might include needing to feed the spirits blood before they become capable of communication. Now, the reason why the Greeks did this, the reason why Circe taught this to our heroes in the Odyssey, is because the dead were considered to hold wisdom. Once you had shuffled off the mortal coil, supposedly you gained this great store of knowledge and wisdom, and if you were properly importuned, if you were properly asked, you could share that wisdom with the person who's doing the asking. During the Middle Ages, necromancy got a really bad rap from the Christian Church, who said that the dead is the province of God, and it is not for men to know what happens after death. So necromancy became a thing that you could get burnt at the stake for and all of those kinds of ugly things. It is also during this time where they started becoming different elements of necromancy. Instead of just communicating with the dead, there also became an element of necromancy where you could raise the dead. There became a practice of necromancy where you could not just raise the dead, but also become undead. You could cheat death eternally by becoming undead. This, of course, gives necromancy a really bad rap because, frankly, your best friend standing up next to you on the battlefield and then turning to fight you if the necromancer is the enemy is a really horrifying thought. But more than that, we as a people have respect for our dead. As a species, we spend a great deal of time on treating our dead well. Funeral practices are some of our most important rituals. And if you'd like me to do a video on funeral practices and how to design them for your fantasy world, let me know in the comments below. Once necromancy started becoming about interfering with the dead, it started to become about treating the dead with disrespect. And when that happened, that's when necromancy really shifted towards the more evil side. Now, this is not universally true in all fantasy. In the Marvel universe, Shuri, T'Challa's sister, can in fact animate the dead, and she is on the heroic side. But even if you have your necromancers on the heroic side, you should be aware of this bias that we have against animating the dead. it should be uncomfortable for the other heroes to work with Suri, because it should be a thing of like, what happens if I die? Is she going to use my body? Is she going to lift me up and make me continue fighting? And that should be a thought that doesn't make you comfortable. But regardless, in terms of villains, they do make very good villains, as witnessed by the plethora of fantasy villains who use them. Sauron is a necromancer. In fact, he was the necromancer at Dol Guldur. And Sauron created the ring wraiths, which are undead. They are the 9 human kings who were raised from the dead and made into these spirits that he has enslaved. In fact, you could argue that Sauron is himself running a necromantic magocracy, because he is the sole ruler of his lands. The reason why I would be hesitant to use Sauron as an example, though, is because he is the sole ruler and he is more than just a single necromancer. He is also the all-seeing eye and a god, effectively. To say that he is a magocracy, yes, it's a theoretical argument, but I think that it's not one that really has merit in terms of analyzing what you want to do with your world. Sauron is a much better example of the single uber-powerful Dark Lord than he is of a magocracy. In that same vein, there have been creatures who have necromantic abilities. Vampires, for example, can make more of themselves. They can make more undead. So they are, in a way, natural necromancers, because they can create more undead, and that is a necromantic ability. In that way, you can also look at the others, or the White Walkers from A Song of Ice and Fire, as being necromantic creatures, since they can create more of themselves and they can very clearly raise undead, as we saw at the magnificent episode of Battle at Hardhome, where the skeletons just kept coming. And that particular battle illustrated the absolute efficiency and overpowered nature of necromantic abilities in battle. If you can continuously replenish your army with a fallen, you become a pretty unstoppable force. If you can raise even the enemy soldiers and turn them against their own comrades, not only do you have an ever-expanding army, but the horror factor alone will see some of your enemies flee the field. Necromancers are devastatingly effective in battle, as we can see in A Song of Ice and Fire. Again, though, I wouldn't analyze that as a form of government. We just don't know enough about the Night King and if there's internal politics within the White Walkers to effectively talk about whether they could be an example of a magocracy. So far, we have spoken about what necromancy is. We've spoken about undead creatures and their natural necromancy. If you like this discussion around what necromancy is and what it offers you as a world builder, hit the thumbs up button. And let's turn our attention to a government run by necromancer. So obviously the first question that you'd have to ask yourself in this case is, what type of necromancy? If your necromancy is the communication style of necromancy, then what you're looking at is a government that knows a lot of things, especially if the dead can divulge the truth of what happened in the past. So they're not necessarily stuck in the point where they only know what they know. After death, they might know more. After death, they might know what really happened. In that case, your government would have an awful lot of accurate information at their disposal. Now, I do want to warn you here that that is a dangerous amount of information to give to any person. if people can just figure out what happened in the past, you lose a lot of tension. Who committed a murder? Who committed a theft? What happened when this event took place? All of those things become definitive answers that you can investigate. So if you're going to do that, make sure that you've got some limitations built in somewhere. Maybe they can only see specific events that they're connected to. Maybe they can only understand specific kinds of questions or specific phrases. Maybe their communication is limited. But something needs to be built in to limit that kind of power. If, on the other hand, your necromancer is the type of necromancer that can raise the dead, now you're starting to get into very interesting territory. What if your government uses undead as cheap labor? Do your living people now live in a absolute utopia where they don't have to work because all labor is supplied by the undead? Is that paradise now offset, though, by the fact that your body doesn't belong to you? When you die, your body belongs to the state, and the state can raise your body and assign it to work wherever they want it to work. On the one hand, you're living in paradise. On the other hand, you're going to spend eternity laboring in the fields as a skeleton or a zombie. I don't know if I'd want to make that trade-off. It feels kind of freaky. Maybe if you grew up in a world like that, it would be fine, and that would be a very interesting society to build. How do they interact with the rest of the society? In such a case, when people visit them and they see all the undead working in the field, are they freaked out? Is this common practice? Does everybody in your world do it? It would be very interesting to build such a society. But that's dumb undead. What if your necromancy also has intelligent undead? What if your necromancy has intelligent undead in the positions of government? Do you now have a bias against the living? Are the living seen as second-class citizens, and the wraiths, the vampires, the lichs, they are the guys who hold the most rights within your land? What about foreign relations in such a case? Does your government send human ambassadors to other countries, or do they send undead ambassadors? And if they send undead ambassadors, how do those countries react? What is the take of other countries on your country if it's run by a vampire, by something that feeds on the living? Does the living part of your population become like cattle? Or perhaps it is a case of, if you are found guilty of a crime and you are living, you are sentenced to become food for the undead who need to feed on the living in order to survive, like the vampires or the wraiths or things like that. Because that is quite often the case with undead, is that they need to feed on the living. And if that's the case, what happens when your ruler is one of these kinds of undead? Where does his food come from? Is it from criminals? Is it from slaves? Is there a rigid caste system and there are these untouchables or really lower class, people who are born into this position where they are raised only as food? But you now have to consider that if you are what you eat, maybe the undead want the highest levels of society as food. And if that's the case, do they rather prey upon the nobility? Is it seen as an honor? If you are drained by the king, does your family benefit from this? Can you secure a dowry for your daughter or a position for your son by allowing the vampire lord to feed on you? Those are all very interesting thoughts to explore in a society where it's not just necromantic, but undead that form your government. And of course, like with all magocracies, it will be a case of flexing will be required to keep your position. And in the case of necromancy, your flexing is done by raising more and more horrifying and quantitative undead. So certainly I could see a lot of undead being everywhere. Undead butlers and undead tables that follow you around so you can rest your drink on your table no matter where you are. Skeletons that have been formed into chairs that run around after you so you can sit down. Things like that would be how I would see the nobility flexing to show that they really are the most powerful and they should be in charge of the country. A strange thought occurred to me while I was doing research for this video. Often, the overthrow of such a necromantic organization is the aim of a fantasy plot. Now, what happens afterwards? Once you've overthrown the necromancy government, what happens to all the undead? Maybe the dumb undead just die. But what if there is intelligent undead? Do you now sit with a situation where you need to deal with undead rights? Do you just kill all these people? What if they're normal citizens going about their normal citizen life, and now you're saying all undead must die, and this dude is actually just the local shopkeeper or the street sweeper or the baker or the smith? Do you just kill all these people? Are there people defending them, seeking rights for undead workers? That, I think, would be a very interesting exploration of the aftermath of a revolution to displace a necromantic government. And those are my thoughts on using necromancy as the driving force behind your magocracy. If you found this video interesting, do check out my magocracy video or any of the videos on my channel. And if you'd like to support me in making more of these videos, you can check out my Ko-fi page or buy my book, both linked down below. And I will see you soon for another video on Just in Time World.